Go ahead and jump into fixing some of the weirder resonances on our mix. This is done on more of a global scale, so if there's an individual sound that has a weird resonance, I'd recommend fixing that in the mix first. But this is kind of taking a more broad approach to our mix and going through and individually reducing some of those harsher resonances. To do so, we're going to be using a plugin called Soothe 2, which is a dynamic resonance suppressor. If you're not already familiar with this plugin, it basically automatically detects and removes unwanted resonances at a given range that you set inside of the plugin. The cool thing about this device is that it's always dynamically responding to your track, so it gives you these ultra natural sounding results that are similar in a lot of ways to like a dynamic EQ, but a lot more advanced and easy to set up, and also a lot more transparent, which is what can make them really great on mix buses. So this plugin is commonly used on individual tracks. A lot of times it's used on vocals, almost like a dynamic de-esser, but it can be really fantastic on mix buses as well. If you want to take a really detailed look at this plugin, I do have a full course on Groove 3 that's all about how to use Soothe 2 if you're looking for an explained course. So let's go ahead and hop over to my mix bus. Went ahead and jumped over to the master channel and added up a blank initialized copy of Soothe 2. Let's go ahead and open that up. And then we can go ahead and close those presets out, drag it over, and start messing around with our plugin. So the really nice thing about Soothe 2, especially when working on a dance record, because we're back at the house record, which again just sounds like this. So the cool thing about using Soothe 2 on a record like this is these types of songs are usually played very loud, either at a club or even in a car. And you want to make sure that there's no resonances popping out of that mix that could be super harsh for a listener, especially when they're playing them back at very loud volumes. So something like Soothe 2 is really great because you can soften up some of those resonant peaks automatically, and that way that record sounds a lot better whenever it's played super loud. So let's go ahead and check out what this is doing so far. This is just the default preset on Soothe 2. And if we take a look at this, you can see it's reducing some of those frequencies in our set range. So basically the way this works is you sort of set this EQ curve and just tell it where you want it to focus. So right over here, it's not focusing on these bass frequencies or on these ultra high frequencies. It's kind of mainly focused in this mid-range area with an additional focus happening right around 4K. You can also solo out what it's doing to sort of dial in exactly the tone that it's removing. And that's all the stuff that's dynamically attenuating. In order to set this up for our mix bus, we really want to focus in on those mid-range. The ultra low frequencies and the ultra high frequencies should already be controlled in your mix. That's something I would recommend messing around with on an individual track level, because you want to make sure that those are nice and balanced before we start talking about mix bus processing. Because we're not trying to fix this with the mix bus, we're trying to just enhance the overall production. So let's go ahead and set this so that it focuses in just on that mid-range stuff. If we just listen to the mix without this plugin on it, we can hear there's quite a bit of resonances and a lot happening in the mid-range. So we got those guitars, the vocal stab, the claps, the hi-hats, all that stuff's happening. A lot of it's just focused in that mid-range. So let's go ahead and address just that little zone of frequencies. So let's go ahead and take this high frequency cut, move it over. You can even make that a little bit steeper. Let's have both of those match. So we'll do the 20 decibel filters. I just want this main kind of mid-range boost here. Let's increase that bell so it's nice and wide. Put it right at about 2K. And then we can basically just focus in on just those lows. Maybe we can make that a bit more subtle of a curve as well, something like that. So now whenever we solo this, it's just focusing on kind of those whistly frequencies. So you can hear, especially in that vocal, there's some weird resonances that it's pulling out. So the effect is really subtle, but it's just kind of addressing some of those resonances that are popping out. And that's really key here because we don't want to go crazy on this. We're just trying to enhance our mix bus. The amazing thing about this is we're getting a very natural sounding resonance suppression. So whenever that song is played super loud, those harsh peaks aren't going to jump out. So then we can play around with the settings a little bit further, the depth control, the sharpness, and the attack and release controls to really dial this in. Also, if you're working on a really long mix bus chain, I recommend putting this at the very end right before a limiter, just so it grabs any resonant peaks that jump out of the mix. Okay, so the first thing that we need to set now that we have kind of more frequency range where we want this plugin to pay attention to, so we need to set the depth, which is just the intensity of our effect. If we go ahead and slam this, we'll get tons of reduction. So even though that's removing a ton of decibels, again, it actually sounds surprisingly natural. And that's, again, what's just really nice about this plugin. So from there, let's go ahead and just set the sharpness, and then we'll dial this back to something more reasonable. This basically sets the intensity of those individual little curves happening in those dynamic reduction. Let me go ahead and play this, and I'll show you what this does. So as I increase this, these little curves get a lot more detailed. Maybe we have that at like 6 or 7. So that way those resonances that are being pulled out are much narrower. Let's also reduce this because obviously that's way too much. But that kind of gives us a little bit more detailed of a dynamic reduction on our track. And especially because we're using this on a mix bus, that level of detail is going to be super important. We don't want this to be more general. We want this to be very specific, and we just want a little bit of that reduction. So then let's dial this back to something more reasonable. Just until we can hear that effect. So we're just looking for that little bit of control. All right, so one of the last things we could set up on this device is going to be our attack and release settings. This basically just controls how fast the effect kicks in and then how long it takes for it to go back up in volume after that effect is done processing. Kind of like the attack release settings on a compressor. So because we want it to sound nice and natural, we want a little bit more attack, so we just have a little bit of snap on those drums. If we have no attack, and I turn this all the way up real quick, you could hear that it basically is pulling out all the snap on those drums. We start to lose some of the transients of our record. Let me go ahead and put that back down to 3.3. And let's go ahead and increase this attack until we get a nice and natural snap happening on all the transients in our track. So the bass, the drums, the claps, and then also even those vocal stabs too. So see how that lets just a little bit more attack in? That's just making that effect a little bit more subtle and more natural inside of our production. Now, the last setting that we could set up is going to be our quality setting. This is basically just deciding the quality of this harmonic reduction algorithm. So if we take a look at this setting here, we could basically choose a oversampling and resolution control. And then there's also some offline processing settings as well. So this is super cool because if I have a session that's really big, has tons of instruments going on, this plugin is very CPU intensive, especially when you're running it on the oversampling or high resolution modes. So this basically lets me set higher resolution, so we could do 4 times oversampling and the ultra high. And basically as I'm listening back, it'll play the lower resolutions. And then once I go in offline bounce my track inside of Ableton, it'll process everything with a higher end algorithm. So just a little bit more CPU efficient that way. But let's go ahead and just set that to same as the real time and then same as my resolution. This basically gives us the option to go through and choose these different oversampling modes. Some will sound better than others. Let's go ahead and just scroll through them and see which sounds best on our mix. So listen to the difference between the 1 times oversampling and the 4 times oversampling. 1 times is a little bit darker. We have a little bit less high frequencies. That kick and all this hi-hat transients come through a lot better on the 4 times. And so because we're using this on a mix bus, I want to go ahead and use that 4-time oversampling so we just get a little bit more detail in those high frequencies. And feel free as well, if this session is super big and the CPU starts to spike over here in Ableton or whatever DAW you're using, you can always go through and change that in the offline processing modes. You can always put this at 4 times, put this at kind of this draft setting here, and then when it bounces, it can change over to 4 times oversampling. But for now, I'll just go ahead and leave it as is because it's working inside of my session. Now let's go ahead and play around with these different resolutions and see how they affect our tone. Let's start off with Eco, and then we'll go to Ultra. So again, those high frequencies are much more natural. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that on 4 times oversampling and the ultra resolution because I think that that sounds the most natural. And again, you can see this is taking up a lot of CPU, so just be aware of that. But that just really gives me a nice resonant reduction on that entire song. And it just sort of opens up that mix a little bit more and makes it sound a lot more balanced. So now I'm going to go ahead and play you before and after with the plugin, and I'll show you the effect that we've created. So it's a really interesting plugin that could be that little bit extra on top of your mix that can sort of help balance everything out. So I really recommend playing around with this on your mix buses and even like drum buses or vocal buses as well. It's a really great plugin that can really enhance your productions.